Have you ever been called a burden by the very person you dedicated your entire life to? That night, my daughter looked into my eyes and said this clear, cold, unblinking, "You're just a burden, Mom." I stood there, paralyzed. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I didn't even shed a tear. I just smiled discreetly. And the next morning, I went to the bank and turned everything off. I'm Eleanor, 72 years old, a retired teacher, a widow. I buried love, raised a daughter alone, and paid all the bills in this house since the day she was born. But none of that mattered at that moment. All she saw in me was a monthly expense. Ungrateful children, they're not born that way. They're shaped by years of silence, by us parents giving too much, forgiving too often, and never asking for anything in return. Until one day, your voice disappears in your own home. And you realize that you've become invisible. You've heard stories like this before, haven't you? Maybe it's your neighbor. Maybe it's you. Maybe you've been left alone in your room after cooking dinner for a family who no longer says thank you. Maybe your name doesn't even appear on their phone screen unless they need something. Have you ever felt this way? As if your years, your sacrifices, your very presence, simply disappeared. That's why I'm telling this. Because real stories of grandmothers, like me, stories of pain, silence, and, eventually, strength need to be heard. Not because we want pity, but because we've earned our voice. You see, what my daughter didn't know is that I wasn't always this quiet old woman. Long before the wrinkles, before the slow steps and the soft voice, I was fire. I built a life. I survived heartbreaks, betrayals, and even the loss of everything one day. And yet, I stood firm. But in this house, I became the backdrop, the woman who just sits there. And yet, even as I sat silently, I watched, I remembered, and I waited, until that sentence, "You are just a burden," awakened something in me. Something I hadn't felt in years. Clarity. Stay with me until the end. Because what I did next wasn't out of anger. It wasn't revenge. It was a quiet revelation. A reclaiming of dignity. And if you've ever felt the pain of being ignored, if you've ever sacrificed your entire life for someone who now treats you like a burden to carry, then what you're about to discover may surprise you. Sometimes, it's not the scream that changes everything. It's the silence that comes after. That morning, I looked at my reflection in the mirror. No makeup, no jewelry, just me and the wrinkles life had carved into my face. For the first time in a long time, I saw no weakness. I saw proof. Proof that I had been more than enough. Proof that I had the right to choose what came next. And that's exactly what I did. But before I tell you how, let me ask you something. Have you ever heard something so cruel from someone you love that it echoes inside your chest for days? If something in this story has rekindled that old wound in you, if a word, a look, a silence from someone close to you has ever made you feel inferior, I want to hear your story too. Leave a comment below, even if it's just a sentence. Sometimes, sharing it out loud is the first step to healing. And I promise you, you're not alone here. Every time you like this video or subscribe to the channel, you're not just supporting a story, you're helping that kind of truth reach someone suffering silently. Someone who might be sitting in a chair like mine right now, feeling invisible. Your support shows that these voices, the ones the world often forgets, still matter. And trust me, they matter. So if this touched you in any way, please take a moment, like, comment, and subscribe. Because it's your voice, along with mine, that keeps this space alive. Now, let me take you back to the morning. Everything changed. I woke early that morning. As always, the house was silent, the kind of silence that makes you feel small in your own home. I walked to the kitchen barefoot, the floor cold beneath my feet, and made a pot of coffee. The same way I've done every day for decades. I spread out a clean towel and folded the clothes, slow, careful movements. My hands know the rhythm of care by heart. T-shirts, socks, sheets, each folded with a kind of reverence no one ever notices. And then I saw it. A photograph tucked between two kitchen drawers. Me, holding Ashley in my arms in the hospital. The day she was born. I looked young, full of hope, tired, but smiling. I remember that day so clearly, the smell of her skin, the way her little fingers entwined with mine. I had made a silent promise then and there that I would give her the world, and for a long time, I did. Birthday cakes, sleepless nights, college tuition, her first apartment, all of it built on my sacrifices. But sacrifice has a funny way of becoming invisible over time. At some point, they stopped being seen as gifts and became expected. I gave and gave until there was nothing left to give, except myself. People see me now, white hair, cardigan buttoned to the neck, soft voice, and think that's all I've ever been. They don't see the woman who taught 30 children every day for 40 years, the woman who ran a tutoring business from her classroom house and helped students struggling to get into college. They don't know that I invested in a small tech idea before people even knew what startup meant. And that company, it's what pays my daughter's bills to this day. But none of that mattered when she looked at me and said, I was a burden. There's a truth about aging that no one talks about. People stop asking who you were. They stop wondering what's hidden behind those tired eyes and slow steps. You become a secondary character in your own life. And unless you speak up, unless you reclaim your space, they'll never see you again. That morning, as the coffee brewed and the aroma perfumed the air, I looked at that photo and felt something shift. Not anger, not even sadness, just a quiet recognition. A truth that had been forming inside me for years. I wasn't just living in that house, I was financing it. I wasn't just the grandmother who cooked and cleaned. I was the reason she had the freedom to live that way. I was the foundation. And somehow, she forgot. I poured myself a cup, sat by the window, and watched the sun rise in the sky. The same sky I used to point to with her when she was little, telling her stories about clouds, shaped like dragons and ships. She used to listen with wide eyes. Now, she barely hears me. That's the thing about silence. It doesn't mean there's nothing to say. It just means no one is listening. But I was listening. To myself. Finally. And that morning, I decided to act. Not with anger, with clarity. With the kind of determination that comes from recognizing your worth. And I knew I had to do something not just for myself, but for all the women who have given too much and gotten too little. So I went to the bank. But before I tell you what happened, I want to ask you one thing. If a single moment in this story made your chest tighten or brought back a memory you thought was buried, write one word in the comments that captures that feeling. Just one. The bank was quiet that morning. It always is around this time, just after the doors open, before the line forms. I waited at the counter until my number was called. The teller greeted me by name, as she always does, with that warm voice people reserve for the elderly. I smiled back, not because I felt warm, but because I knew exactly what I was about to do. The conversation was simple, calm. I signed some paperwork, made some transfers, closed one account, protected another. It was like putting padlocks on the doors of my own dignity, not to keep people out, but to prevent anyone from coming in and taking what I hadn't earned. I didn't tremble. I didn't hesitate. I simply did what needed to be done. It's strange how power doesn't always come from shouting. Sometimes it comes in the form of silence, of knowing, with certainty, that you've reached the end of one story and the beginning of another. When I got home, she was still on the phone. Ashley, sitting on the couch, legs crossed, talking loudly enough that she must have thought I wouldn't hear or wouldn't care if I did. She's just expensive. She always needs something. I can't wait to sell that house and move. She won't even notice. My hand was still on the doorknob. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The words cut through the air so softly they almost didn't seem real. But they were. Each syllable landed like a silent explosion in my chest. My daughter, my only daughter, speaking of me as if I were a thing, an item on her to-do list, a weight she was waiting to lift. There's a kind of pain that doesn't scream. It doesn't need to scream. It simply settles in the bones, heavy, patient, and unforgettable. I stood there for a long time, watching her laugh at everything her friends said next, oblivious. She hadn't seen me, not just in that moment, for years. I was right in front of her, and somehow invisible. I was the roof over her head, the warm food she never questioned, the name behind the steady deposits that paid her bills. But in her eyes, I was reduced to a burden, something she tolerated until it was more convenient to let go. And in that instant, something inside me snapped, not violently, not dramatically, but with a cold, definitive clarity. I realized I had been part of a story in which my character had no voice, a supporting character in a life I had helped build. And if I didn't speak, if I didn't act, I would disappear completely, not because of age, but because of silence. So I walked into the kitchen, poured myself another cup of coffee, and sat at the table as if it were any other morning. She walked past me without even looking. I looked at her, really looked, and for the first time, I didn't see the baby-eyed, once rocked to sleep, nor the little girl who'd run to me after school. I saw a grown woman, capable, entitled to anything, and blind to the cost of the comfort she lived in. The transformation had begun not just around me, but within me. I wasn't angry, not yet. What I felt was something deeper, an awakening. That moment revealed a truth I hadn't wanted to see, that love, when taken for granted for too long, begins to decay. And when that love comes from a parent, their absence leaves a silence so loud it echoes through every room in the house. Thought so, I waited. I waited for her to realize what had changed, for the wave of my decision to reach her, for her to search for something that was no longer there, the account, the backup, the silent safety net she thought would always protect her. But change doesn't announce itself. It happens silently, in locked drawers, signed documents, and a look that says, "You don't know me anymore." If you've reached that point, the moment where you realize you're no longer going to be looked down upon right enough in the comments, that same night, I went to my room and closed the door without saying a word, not out of coldness, but because words had become useless. I sat at my desk, the one she always mocked for being old-fashioned, and opened the notebook where I kept everything. Years of receipts, handwritten notes, passwords, silent records, of the life I had built. She never saw them, never asked. For her, things simply worked because that was how they were supposed to. But I knew better. I knew what was needed. And now, I was going to rewrite the terms. As I flipped through the pages, I saw the trail of every small decision I'd made that led me to this moment, when I'd paid her tuition, even though I was still paying for her father's funeral, when I'd signed her first lease, even though I knew she wouldn't pay, when I'd lent her money and never asked for it back. Every line in that notebook wasn't just a number. It was a piece of me, and suddenly, I could feel how much of myself I'd given away. She always thought I kept those notes because I was controlling. What she never realized is that I kept them because they were my only proof, my silent way of not disappearing completely. And now, those notes would become something completely different, a reminder of my worth. I closed the book slowly, as carefully as someone would close a chapter in their life. Not because I was angry, but because I was clear. That was the change. Not dramatic, not loud, just definitive. A mental reorganization of everything I believed about what it meant to be a mother. There's a truth people rarely admit, that even the most loving hearts reach a breaking point, not out of spite, but from years of being pushed too far, from giving themselves away unseen, from remaining silent in the name of peace, until silence begins to feel like erasure. And I had reached that point, silently, without apology. That night, I prepared dinner. I set the table. We ate in silence. She checked her phone between bites. She didn't ask how my day had been. She didn't realize I'd retreated into something more solid than resentments, something sharper than disappointment. It wasn't sadness anymore. It was distance, a silent, undeniable distance she didn't yet realize had been built, brick by her own words, her own negligence. She was used to my reaction, to my tenderness, to my insistence on pretending nothing had happened. But what she didn't know was that I had changed the plot, that I was no longer going to play the role. This was the beginning of a transformation, not just in my mindset, but in the energy I chose to carry. I stopped anticipating her needs. I stopped offering before she even asked. I began to notice my own needs again when I was tired, when I wanted space, when I no longer felt comfortable being the invisible backbone of her life. She still didn't see. She still lived as if nothing had changed, but it had everything. That's the thing about dignity. When you reclaim it, it doesn't always come with a speech. Sometimes it simply stays with you in the room, changing the air, the temperature, the way people feel as they pass you by. And even if they don't know what has changed, they feel it. I began to see her through a new lens, not with bitterness. That was never my way, but with honesty. I saw the choices she made, the way she spoke to me, the sense of entitlement she wore like perfume. And I understood, finally, that I wasn't doing her any favors by staying silent, that by allowing her to treat me as inferior, I was reinforcing her own delusion. No more. From that moment on, every look I gave, every gesture, every pause, carried a weight. The kind of weight that comes from knowing exactly who you are and refusing to recede into the background. There's a kind of power that comes when a woman, especially one who's been ignored for too long, stops explaining herself. And that's the power I tapped into, not loudly, not defiantly, but with unshakable calm. It was the beginning of a new agreement. I would no longer participate in my own erasure, and without knowing it yet, she was already beginning to feel the difference. If any part of this reminded you of a time when you finally saw someone nor yourself clearly, right, I see now in the comments, she still had no idea. And that was the beauty of it, the silent unfolding of something she couldn't see. I moved around the house as always, the same soft steps, the same polite nods, the same calm voice, but inside, I was working, strategizing, preparing. Late one night, while she was fiddling with her phone and laughing at random, I opened the drawer containing the house documents. She didn't even look at it twice. It was just one of those things that existed in the back of her life, like me. But now, every line of every contract felt different, alive. It wasn't paperwork anymore. It was power, and it was mine. I reviewed the house's ownership. Her name wasn't there. It never had been. She always assumed that one day, when I was too tired to manage things, the house would simply fall into her lap, that she would inherit what she never contributed to. She thought love meant entitlement, but she never saw the difference between a gift and something given. I made a few calls. Discreetly, I rearranged some things. I locked others. I changed my account passwords, not in a way that looked suspicious, but in a way that made them mine again. I created a new account, one she hadn't even known existed. I moved funds slowly and methodically. Not everything, just enough to protect what was mine, just enough to ensure that, when the time came, I could choose what stayed and what went. The funny thing is, she didn't notice. Not when I started checking the mail before she did. Not when I stopped leaving bills on the counter for her to look at. Not when I went to the bank 3 times in 2 weeks and came back smiling, as if I'd just had coffee with an old friend. People underestimate silence. They think silence means surrender. But silence, in the right hands, is a weapon. It's a form of presence so powerful that it makes the other person think nothing is happening, until everything changes. At one point, she asked if I needed help with the groceries. It was the first time in weeks she'd acknowledged me beyond a passing comment. I looked her in the eye and said, "I'll take care of it, honey." As always. But this time, I meant something completely different. Because what she didn't know, what she couldn't even imagine, was that I no longer feared her absence. For years, I'd clung to the idea that being needed was the same as being loved, that if I kept giving, kept being useful, kept sacrificing, I'd remain essential. But now I saw the truth I'd buried under years of automatic love and silent heartbreak. I was never meant to prove myself, especially not to someone who only looked to you when they needed a favor. This shift in mindset changed everything. My movements became intentional. I began to walk with the weight of someone who had finally remembered their own story. I began to recognize the difference between connection and dependence. What I was building wasn't revenge. It was recovery. I was no longer angry. I was aware, and in awareness, I found the ability to navigate without fear. I didn't need to advertise what I was doing. I didn't need validation or permission. I'd lived enough years being the backdrop to someone else's life. Now, I was returning to my own. The house felt different, no longer noisy, no longer cold, just brighter. The walls that once echoed with the sound of my silent hope now gave way to my decisions, and in the silence, I felt something unfamiliar. Peace, not the kind of peace that comes from calm, but the kind of peace that comes from knowing you're no longer at the mercy of others' carelessness. With each passing day, I added a new piece to my silent plan, an altered account, a protected document, a rewritten detail on an insurance form. I made copies. I saved passwords in new places. I smiled at her as if nothing had changed, and then that smile lay the most powerful truth of all. Everything had changed. She was planning a weekend trip with friends. She talked about how she couldn't wait to finally move out of that boring, old house. I folded my clothes in the next room, pretending not to hear, but every word sharpened my concentration. She had no idea how much that boring old house was about to teach her. She brushed past me with a half-hearted "see you later," already halfway to the door. I looked at her back, the same girl I once taught to tie her shoes. Now walking as if the world belonged to her, felt nothing but clarity, not sadness, not nostalgia. Just the kind of quiet power that only comes when you know exactly who you are and exactly what you're about to do. If you've ever built something in silence, something just for you, a plan, a boundary, a truth, right? I chose myself in the comments. The door closed behind her with a click, and just like that, silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence as before, not that empty silence that made me feel small. This silence had weight. It felt earned. It felt mine. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence envelop me. Then, almost without thinking, I walked slowly down the hallway of my house. Each step echoed off the walls as if I were hearing the house for the first time, or perhaps as if it were hearing me. I passed the mirror in the hallway and saw my reflection. My face, so familiar and yet so strange, marked by years, marked by periods of sacrifice, the kind of face you don't really look at anymore because life doesn't give you time to stop. But I stopped now. I looked closely. Behind those eyes, there were stories. So many that had never been told. Nights sitting by her bedside during high fevers, my own body aching with exhaustion. Mornings rushing to work with only a piece of toast in my stomach because the last bit of milk went into her cereal. I remembered the winter I sold my necklace, the one my husband gave me for our 10th anniversary, just to pay the last of her tuition. She never knew. I never told her. Because I didn't want her to carry the guilt. I just wanted her to fly. But looking back, I wonder if hiding these truths only made them invisible. If shielding her from the weight of what I gave made everything she thought was easy. Maybe love given too freely loses its shape. Maybe that was my mistake making. It all seemed effortless. I walked into her old room. It still smelled faintly of perfume and shampoo. There were still a few posters on the wall, their corners peeling, forgotten but stubborn. I ran my fingers over her desk. I used to sit there while she did her homework, pretending to read while watching her progress. When she cried over math problems, I'd draw silly cartoons in the corners of her worksheets just to make her smile again. That room had seen more of my silent devotion than anyone else ever would. And yet here I was, walking through it like a guest, not out of nostalgia, but because I needed to feel the truth of it, to remind myself that I wasn't imagining the depth of what I was giving, that my pain wasn't a reaction to a single sentence she'd said last week. It was the final note of a song she'd been playing for years. We often think betrayal arrives in a big moment, something loud and obvious, but sometimes it's a slow erosion, a smile that disappears, a thank you that never arrives, a door that's always open, but no one knocks anymore. It's her walking past me without noticing the dinner I prepared. It's the way she rolled her eyes when I asked how her day was. It's the absence of presence. This is the kind of betrayal that hurts the most, not because it's cruel, but because it's careless. So I stood there, in her room, letting the memories rise like dust in the sunlight. I didn't cry, I didn't break, I simply took inventory, not of what I had lost, but of what I had given. And it was in this silent reckoning that I felt the shift solidify. My journey wasn't about revenge. It was about seeing clearly, about letting go of the role I had played for so long, the one that forced me to disappear so she could shine. And I finished disappearing. I went back to the kitchen and made a cup of tea. Not for her, just for me. This was new, and strange, and good. I sipped it slowly, the steam rising like a silent declaration. I sat in her empty chair, leaned back, and listened, not her voice, not the noise of the world, but something deeper. My own rhythm returning. That house, once filled with noise, had become my mirror. Every corner contained a reflection of the woman I used to be, and the woman I was becoming, and I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that I could never go back to who I was. If you've ever been in a room and felt your own story come flooding back, a story no one saw, but you lived fully, right? I remember everything in the comments. The tea was warm in my hands, but I barely noticed. My mind was so full, not of anger, not even sadness, but of a strange clarity that felt simultaneously heavy and liberating. It's strange to walk through the same rooms you've lived in for decades, and finally feel them differently, as if the house was always trying to speak, and I had just learned to listen. And maybe that's why I'm telling this story, because I know I'm not the only one who has sat in silence, wondering if their sacrifices were invisible. I know I'm not the only one who has been silent for too long, waiting for love to see what words never said. And I know deep down that there are people listening now who have their own silent storm brewing inside. If anything in this story reminded you of a moment you experienced, or made you feel something you haven't yet expressed in words, I invite you to share it below. Not just for me, but for everyone who needs to know they're not alone. A single comment can resonate in someone's heart and remind them of their worth. And if this story touched you in any way, even for a brief moment, if it made you stop, reflect, or feel seen, know that liking this video or subscribing to this channel helps these voices spread. It helps this space remain open, honest, and alive. What we're building here isn't just storytelling, it's a place where the truth doesn't go unnoticed. So, thank you truly for being here, for watching with all your heart, for reading between the lines, for letting stories like mine breathe. Now, let me tell you what happened the day she finally realized something was missing. It happened on a Sunday, the kind of morning that used to feel sacred. Pancakes, the radio silent in the background, sunlight falling across the table in soft streaks. I made coffee, as always. I toasted her favorite bread. I set the table carefully, the way she liked it when she really noticed such things. But that day, I wasn't doing it out of habit, I was doing it with intention. Because that morning wasn't routine, it was revelation. Ashley arrived late, still fiddling with her phone, yawning between strides, as if the world owed her sleep. She didn't look up immediately. She just dropped her bag by the door and sat down, barely glancing at me. I handed her a cup of coffee. She accepted it without a word, and then I slid the folder across the table. Just a thin, worn envelope. Nothing flashy. But inside it lay a truth she'd never imagined facing, not because I'd hidden it, but because she'd never thought to look. She paused, one hand still on her phone. "What is this?" I didn't answer right away. I let the silence take its toll. Then I said, softly but firmly, "Perhaps you'd like to read it." She pulled out the papers: bank statements, account summaries, a copy of the property deed, a letter from the bank manager, and a typed note in my handwriting. I watched her face change as she read the words, the furrow in her brow, the disbelief tightening in her jaw, the way she blinked harder than usual, as if the page were blurry before her. Then she looked at me, not with anger, not even fear, just confusion. "What is that?" I leaned forward, not coldly, not cruelly, just certainty. "No more thinking that I'll be here to catch you whenever you fall." She didn't say anything. "You once said I was just a burden, an item, a weight. Well, now, you carry your own weight." I took a slow sip of my coffee. The sound of the spoon hitting the rim seemed louder than it should have. Her eyes scanned the paperwork again, as if she read quickly enough, she could change. Her voice cracked. "You touched the money." I nodded. "I transferred the funds. The bills. The house is no longer in your future, unless I decide it is." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked like someone trying to wake from a dream too vivid to be fiction. I could see it in her posture, the slow undoing of entitlement, the realization that her safety net was no accident. It was always me. The moment wasn't one of anger. It wasn't loud. It was surgical, clean, a dismantling of a structure she had stepped on without knowing who built it. She finally whispered, "Why now?" And this was the moment I'd been waiting for. Because the answer wasn't about money, or her. It was about a line I'd crossed internally, the silent transition from survival to suffering. Because I needed to remember who I am. And I needed you to see that too. Her eyes filled with tears, just a little. She blinked rapidly and looked at the table, as if that might give her a different ending. But there was no rewrite. No salvation, just the truth, revealed between a mother and a daughter who had long ago stopped seeing her as a person. She didn't eat her toast, she didn't finish her coffee. She sat there, silent, surrounded by a truth she wasn't prepared for, the kind of truth that reshapes your understanding of a person. I had become a new person to her in that moment. Not because I had changed, but because I had finally stopped pretending. Sometimes the most radical act of love is letting someone feel the weight of their own decisions, not to punish them, but to give them a rare chance to grow. And for the first time in a long time, I felt light, not because I had hurt her, but because I had finally honored myself. If you've ever had to let someone deal with the truth of their own choices, right? I stood my ground in the comments. The next morning, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, the same place I'd placed those papers the day before. But now the table was empty. Only her hands rested on the surface, her fingers twitching as if she were trying to hold on to something that had already slipped away. She looked different, not smaller, not broken. but distraught in a way I hadn't seen her since I was a lost child in the supermarket. The difference now was that no one would come looking for her. At first, I didn't say anything. I poured myself a glass of water, opened the curtains to let in the light, and walked around the room as I always did. She followed me with her eyes, silent. Then she finally spoke. "I tried calling Mark," she said quietly, almost shakily. "He didn't answer." I nodded, not out of spite, but because I knew what she was really saying. She wasn't just talking about Mark. She'd also called 3 other people, friends she always bragged about, the ones who always seemed to show up when the drinks were free or the favor was easy. But none of them had answered. That was the beginning of the unraveling. When your illusions start to pull at your own strings. She didn't need to say the rest. I could see it on her face. The worry that the safety net she assumed would always be there for her was gone. Not just financially, emotionally, morally. It was the first time she had to face her own reflection without the protection of someone else's sacrifice. "You always made things look easy," she said after a long pause. I smiled. Just a little. That was part of the problem. She looked down at her hands again, and I saw the weight she was beginning to carry. Not guilt, not yet, but awareness. The first stages of seeing life through a lens untainted by entitlement. "Did you change everything?" she asked. I sat down across from her. My tone wasn't harsh, just sincere. "Yes." "Where to?" "Wherever it is protected. Wherever I decide." Her eyes filled with tears again, but she didn't let them fall. There was still pride there. There was still resistance, but it was softening. "I never thought you. She trailed off. "That's exactly why I had to do it," I said. "You never thought I would do it, because I trained you to believe I wouldn't." The silence that followed was heavy, but not cruel. It was necessary. Like the air finally clearing after a long storm, she was beginning to reflect on her own decisions, the silent mathematics of cause and effect. This is how the law of return works. It doesn't always return with fury. Sometimes it returns with stillness, with the cold space between what you expected and what actually is. She tried again that afternoon. She called another friend. She left another voicemail, but she got no answer. And I saw the realization sink in that I was never the one who stopped her. I was always the one who held her back. The roles were never what she thought they would be. She wasn't the one helping me. I was the foundation, the reason she walked so freely, spoke so confidently, lived so lightly, because she never had to feel the ground shake beneath her feet, until now. And all I said, as she stood there uncertainly, was, "Don't call a foundation a burden." It wasn't revenge. It wasn't punishment. It was revelation. The revelation of a truth that had always been there, but that she refused to face until it appeared right in front of her, and didn't blink. You could almost see it in her, the subtle collapse of false confidence, the reckoning. Not with me, with herself. Because that's what happens when you think someone will always be there. You stop treating them like they matter. And when they finally get up and leave, or worse, when they stay but don't give in, any hits differently. It resets something. That night, she didn't eat dinner. She stayed in her room, quiet. And I didn't go after her. I didn't check. I didn't knock. Because part of her transformation had to happen without me. The part where she realized the difference between love and expectation, between generosity and permission, between being cared for and being carried. If you've ever been the person someone leaned on without realizing the weight you were putting on them, right? I was the pillar in the comments. The next day felt heavier, not because of the chaos, there wasn't any. The house was silent, as usual. But something had shifted in the air, a kind of heaviness that arises when light settles in the corners. I stood by the window watering my plants, watching the sunlight hit the leaves just right. That small ritual, something I'd done so many times without thinking, suddenly felt like a lifeline. There's comfort in caring for something that simply receives, without conditions, without complaints, without entitlements. The water trickled slowly, and I found myself whispering to the soil, as if the plants were old friends who had watched it all unfold. Perhaps they had. They had been here through it all, the laughter that used to echo through this house, the silent dinners, the cold mornings when I felt invisible under the weight of their neglect. They had witnessed the entire arc of this silent story. They had heard what no one else had. And as I stood there, one hand gently tilting the watering can, I heard her door open. Her steps were slow, unsteady. She didn't enter the room. She just stood in the hallway as if testing the air, trying to read the new energy she'd helped create. I didn't turn to look. I didn't say anything because sometimes presence says more than conversation ever could. I could feel her watching me, perhaps waiting for a sign that things had calmed down, that I was ready to return to my old self. But there was no going back. That version of me, the one who absorbed every slight, every eye roll, every passive insult, was no longer there. What remained was someone who had paid a silent price for her own peace. And that price was my daughter. Not the loss of her body in this house, but the loss of what she represented to me: hope, purpose, legacy. For so long, I had anchored my identity in being her mother, her guide, her support, but in doing so, I had blurred the lines between giving and erasing, between being loving and being used, between being needed and being respected. Now, I was none of those things. Not in her world, and in mine, I was something completely new. A woman rebuilding her center, not around others, but around herself. I went out with the rest of the water and gently poured it over the roots of the rosebush. My husband had planted it years ago, when we still believed family was sacred and unbreakable. The flowers were blue, fuss or showiness, just steady, resilient, like the women in my family have always been, even when no one noticed. It was then that the pain came, not regret, not doubt, just the slow, steady ache of truth sinking in. I had done the right thing. I had protected what was left of me. I had chosen peace over default. But peace comes with its own silence, the kind that echoes in a house once full of noise. I hadn't just changed the structure, I had dismantled it. And the result was silence, not the comforting kind, the reflective kind. She didn't say anything that day. Neither did I. We moved like shadows of ourselves, passing each other without touching, two people on opposite sides of a long, invisible chasm. I saw her glance at her phone again. Still no messages. Still no returned calls. The silence she once offered so freely had finally come back to visit her. And yet, I didn't hate her. I couldn't. She was mine, always had been. But that no longer meant I had to be hers at the expense of myself. I sat by the window as the sky turned from gold to gray. The house, though silent, didn't feel empty. It felt honest, as if it were finally revealing the truth of what it had kept hidden for so many years. I let that truth wash over me, gently. I let the pain and relief blend into one breath. Because yes, I had one. I had reclaimed something that was mine. But the cost of that victory was visible in every corner of this house, in the silence that followed her footsteps, in the way I now drank tea without waiting for her to join me, in the space between who we were and what we had become. This is the part no one tells you about standing your ground. It brings dignity, yes, but also distance. You gain yourself, but you lose the illusion that love alone is enough. If you've ever chosen peace, knowing it would cost you something sacred, right? I chose truth over comfort in the comments. I sat in front of the window that night, the light fading, only the last traces of twilight outlining the furniture like soft memories. The room was silent, not in that eerie way, but in a kind of earned silence, the kind that only comes when the noise has already made itself felt and nothing remains but the truth. My eyes fell on a framed photo across the room. It was of Hershey, around 10 years old, her arms around my waist, the two of us laughing. It was one of those rare, captured moments when everything seemed simple and pure. No resentment, no roles, just love, raw and uncomplicated. And as I stared at her, I allowed myself to feel it all: the nostalgia, the pain, the bittersweet knowledge that time only moves in one direction. There is no going back, only lessons. I thought about everything we've built over the years, the invisible architecture of care, the silent effort that holds a family together, the way we patch holes, hide cracks, smile through tears just to keep the structure standing, until one day we realize we've become the walls of the very house where we're being forgotten, present in every corner, but no longer seen. There's a kind of wisdom that only comes with distance, not physical, but emotional, the space between expectation and reality, between who you expected them to be and who they are. And this space hurts, but it also teaches. It has the power to reshape your understanding of what it means to love without erasing yourself. I don't know if she ever understand what it really was. Maybe one day, she'll sit alone and see it as I do now, not as a mother's obligation, but as a lifetime of choices, silent decisions, daily acts of devotion that cost more than anyone ever asked. Maybe she'll look at her own reflection and see the legacy I tried to leave. Not in money, not in property, but in the way I lived and gave, even when unseen. And if that day comes, I hope she forgives herself. I hope she chooses differently. Because the truth is, no one owes you their soul, not even the person who created it. Love is not a transaction. It is not something given. It must be cherished, honored, spoken aloud. Many wait until it is too late, until the voice on the other end of the line is silenced forever. And in that moment, all that remains is the echo. If you still have a mother not just alive, but accessible, hold her hand, look her in the eyes, thank her. Not with flowers once a year, nor with hurried phone calls on the way home, but with presence, with intention. Because one day, you might find yourself in a room like this, looking at a photo, longing for another shared moment. I never needed grand gestures. I never wanted anything extravagant. Just respect. Just to be seen. And now that I've given myself that, I know what it's like to stand firm, even after everything. Because the truth is that when silence becomes your only language, something inside you dies, or resurfaces. If this story made you reflect on someone you once considered insignificant, or someone who once carried your world without complaint, right? I see her now in the comments. If you stayed with me through every word, every silence, every shift in this story, thank you. That means something. It means this message found a space within you, maybe a memory, maybe a mirror, maybe just the desire not to let these stories go unnoticed. If this conversation made you reflect, if it gave you something that felt true, please leave a like, not because you have to, but because it helps keep this space alive, a space where real stories find attentive ears. And if you've made it this far, leave a comment. I went all the way with you, just so I know that, on the other side, there are people walking with me. If this kind of content strengthens you, brings clarity, touches you deeply, subscribe to the channel. This shows me that it's worth continuing to put into words what so many people feel, but can't express. There's a video here that speaks directly to what we've been through together. Click on it and stay with me there. There's still a lot of truth for us to discover.